Welcome to the Storytellers, the radio show and podcast that features those who choose to leave their mark on the world through the art of story. I'm your host, Grace Sammon. I look forward to our time together today. Now, let's meet our storyteller. Welcome to episode 100 of The Storytellers with Tracy Barone, film executive producer, writer, and critically acclaimed novelist. I'm so excited to welcome Tracy to the Storytellers microphone because she has worked on all sides of the desk. Her career started out in New York, where she was a playwright and director. And when she wanted to know even more about how to get her works in front of audiences, she went to LA, embraced the film studios, became a top executive, and has worked at every single important studio that I know of: Columbia, TriStar, Warner Brothers. She was president of one of the Warner Brothers divisions. She has worked on development, as I mentioned, and films that everybody knows about: Men in Black, Benjamin Button, Guarding Tess, and Ali. She's worked on Wild Wild West, Rosewood, and so many others. I love being able to welcome Tracy Barone to the Storytellers microphone. Tracy, hello.
Hi, Grace. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you and share stories with your audience.
Well, I wanted to start right out with that exact thought. Why storytelling? Why is that so important to you?
I was a natural storyteller. I will say that I couldn't read, and my father would always say, I would sit on his lap and we would have a book and I would make up the story. So everybody thought I knew how to read, but I was just looking at the pictures and telling a story. And that was in my blood. And I think it's the way that I make sense of the world. So that was my way, and I wanted to do it in every form. And besides for a few, I think I've done most forms of writing.
Well, you have done most forms of writing, and the production side of the house, the big job, president. What's the thing that intrigues you most?
Right now, I think it is because I think the world is in such a place where we've had changing technologies. We've got AI and everybody's sort of a flutter. What is this going to mean? What is it going to mean for telling stories? Writers are concerned it's going to kind of replace. How does it fit in with the creative vibe? How are we going to be able to write when everybody can just say they can write because they can punch in on ChatGPT? But I think more than ever, telling a story, how we tell a story, whether we use these new technologies, whether we don't, whether we design immersive experiences. I kind of embrace the technology if it's used in a spiritually and kind of morally conscious way, where we can get all different forms of storytelling. I think it's actually really exciting.
I agree with you. I'm relatively new to ChatGPT, and as you and I talked in the green room before, I think I have another novel in me, and I asked it to outline a novel that does not exist. So that it's fascinating. I love, with all of the variety that you have done, from the directing to the playwriting to all of the writing, and the for probably not the most politically correct, big girl job of being in the film industry. I love that your bio talks about you go back to your roots when you wrote your book, which I absolutely fell in love with, Happy Family.
Thank you.
Talk about that.
Yeah.
Your writing is your roots.
Well, I think it is. And I think if anybody who's got an impulse to write, or people who are a lover of stories, it's sort of where your home is. For me, I loved empowering other writers. I loved being able to I kind of think like one of my superpowers was to be able to sometimes we'd have all this complex things and you'd have 5 stories going on, but what is the one that is needing to be told and is the one that's going to be the most compelling, the most propulsive, and the most emotionally fulfilling and rewarding story. So it's kind of, I could always see this sort of, oh, this is where it is. And I think for me, wanting to, instead of being behind the scenes and empowering others, and I think being a producer, you're a little bit like a handmaiden, a good producer. It's like you want to empower the creative people, you want to be part of the birthing process, but it's not really of you, it's not your essence, right? And to me, writing is of the essence. It is telling something that's deeply personal, even if it's not, and being able to kind of filter it through this instrument. And I think that I wouldn't have felt satisfied fully if I didn't come home to writing. And weirdly, to the one thing I hadn't done, which was a novel, which was the scariest thing, was, oh my God, how am I going to write a novel? I wasn't a novel. I've all this experience in script writing and dramatic writing, but it was what called to me, and it wouldn't go away. And it was just saying, you got to write me. And eventually I was like, okay,
Why
I
was it the
surrender.
scariest?
I think writing a novel, somebody once told me it's like trying to get out of prison like Leavenworth with just a spoon. And you're chipping away, and you can't see. You've got a little tunnel, but you can't see where you're going, and you've got so far to go. So I think it's the length of it, or just the fact that you are in such a large story and there's no familiar markers, you know? I mean, screenwriting or writing for TV and film, it's very structured. You've got to structure like an architect, but, and you do have some structure in a novel, but you're just out there for, you know, days, months, chipping away. And I think that scared me. That was a little scary at first.
I think that's interesting because I find writing is, I describe it as the most naked thing I do.
Mhm,
That people have a window into my soul, whether it's an accurate or not.
mhm,
They travel a journey with us. But I
yeah,
was interested that you were talking about it in that manner, because when you write for film or the theater, you can go and you can listen to see how people are responding.
mhm, mhm.
Sometimes I think that when we write a novel, it's out there and then we're not engaging anymore sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the reverse, right? Because what is difficult about screenwriting or script writing, I guess at the general umbrella of script writing, is you're not writing for anybody to read it. You're writing for very few people to read it, and then for it to be made, right? So it is, and if it doesn't go for whatever reason, nobody gets to read that work. But the beautiful thing is that you do have a lot of collaboration along the way. But as a novelist, people will read your book. It is out there, and those words and the sentences, and the poetry, language is so important to me. So I don't get to play with that in scripts the way you can in longer form, and certainly in the novel, which is, I think, I'm going to say it's my favorite.
Oh, I'm so glad, because as I said, Happy Family was one of my favorite reads this year. And part of it was your beautiful use of language. I had so many things highlighted, but you talk about the character talking about Catholicism was like a borrowed dress she'd worn so long it conformed to all of her curves. And the imagery to that, as somebody who grew up Catholic, was just
Mm.
absolutely amazing. But you touch on so many issues about adoption and belonging. You talk about things that just made me laugh out loud, because I ate so many Howard Johnson clam rolls, and
I know,
they
right?
they
That
were right.
orange, and it's so, I know.
Yes, and bazooka
You're
bubble
East
gum.
Coast.
Yes,
Yeah.
I grew up on Long Island, so I was right there with some of these
Mm.
characters. But you tackle head on some really family dysfunction. Do you want to
Mhm.
talk about that?
I think that one of the themes that I was writing in Happy Family, and I think is so interesting, just the idea that sometimes it takes half a life to come of age. Like, really, we don't come of age until we understand who our parents were and see them not as our parents. And for so many of us, that comes later, right? When you're having kids, or when you're thinking about having kids, or
Yes.
you have a crisis, or your world falls apart. And there's so many. It's funny because I just recently did this. It's called the Hoffman process, which is a sort of a therapeutic but spiritually oriented retreat where you look at patterns that you've inherited from your parents, and that we all have these things called negative love syndrome, which is from either in reaction to our parents' patterns, or because we're adopting them for survival. And so much of that process was about, how do you forgive your parents? And I hadn't done it before I wrote the book, but I think so much of where who we are and how we hand things down intergenerational is because of these wounds we have, which may or may not be based on the truth. And once we find empathy and compassion and we know our parents' story and we can see how it still lives in us or lives in opposition to us, that's when we can really find freedom. And I think for me, dealing with the dysfunction of her family, because she had both this big question, who am I? Because she didn't know her biological parents. And I think it's so interesting with adoption, what's bred in the bone, what's nature, what's nurture, what's chance, what's,
Yes.
it's so ripe for exploration. And here you've got this character who's very oppositional in a lot of ways and very, following what you find out later is something that's in her bloodline. But she's in this family that loves her and has all these good intentions. Everything starts off with good intentions. And then it goes awry, often horribly. And yet within it, everybody's in a way doing the very best they can at that moment. And I think that in exploring the characters, I wanted to show both the mess and the ugliness and the awful behavior, as well as the genuine desire to do good or to do better, and kind of where that tension is.
And you do that so well, and every single character is so richly drawn. I was thinking about how potential actors would read this and say,
Mm-hmm.
"I want to play this
Mm-hmm.
character." Even Cookie, who is
Mm-hmm.
important to the
Yeah.
story, but
Right.
perhaps not pivotal. She, if she walked into the room, I would know who she is. She's would we describe her as a housekeeper, a help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's a housekeeper, and especially back in the 60s, it was like, but she becomes Cece's confidant and her supporter. And, I think you had that a lot, especially back in those days with women who stayed home. And, Cece's very lonely, and Cookie is this sort of ballast to her from like the beginning, where she takes her to the hospital when she's losing her baby, to when she's saying, well, I'll offer to kill off this guy for cheating on you. So she's, I think that relationship, I didn't have a huge amount of time to explore it in the book, but I actually love that relationship. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Very much so. You spoke just a moment ago about how we operate in our life based on what we think happened, whether it's true or not. And that makes me think of a piece that you wrote for, I believe it was Oprah, called What I Wish
Mm,
I Knew Before Getting Divorced. And that
mm,
piece also spoke to me. Can you talk
mm.
about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's I guess it must be such a theme for me, but so much of how we act, it's like, and especially with divorce, I mean, it's also like what people don't tell you about being pregnant, right? Or they don't tell you about what happens when you hit menopause. It's like there's these transitions we go through, and so many of us go through them. But for me, there are these moments and these key moments, like I wrote in that piece, being in a grocery store and you're always shopping for your family or your husband, and all of a sudden what you bought him would bring me to tears. It's not that, I mean, it was a difficult divorce, it's complicated, but this was something that was part of my daily routine, and it's not anymore. And it's the little things, I think it's the little things that you don't you're not prepared for. You're not prepared for how the cycles of grief go. And even if you're complete that this is the right thing, something will just hit you and you'll just be, set on your pins. So,
French vanilla ice cream for me. I can tell you the aisle it was
right?
in, and I had my hand on the French vanilla ice cream, and I was like, "Oh no, my world is over." And of
I
course, our
know. And then
world
you're like, God damn it. I didn't like having that in my, I mean, it's like
there
you
wasn't
get
room
all
for
these
it
voices.
anyway.
Yeah, exactly. There was a room and you made me fat, and you could go
Yeah.
into the whole thing. Yeah. No.
But also there's a wonderful ending to that piece, which I think is
Mm,
a life lesson for all of
mm,
us. Would you share how
mm.
you end that piece?
Um, Gosh, I'm so funny because I wrote that and then I wrote another one for I think it was the LA Times about the end process of after divorce. So I don't know which one you're referring to, but I think this one Are you talking about that one? Because the
I
LA
am. I
Times
was
one,
talking
maybe.
about how the two of you were looking across each other and there was coffee involved and you just,
Yes, yes, exactly. It's like we both realized, I think after all was said and done in court and all this, we both could say, oh God, I wish I had let go of the house sooner, or I wish I'd let you keep that. Or, there was this recognition of what were we doing, and if we knew better or we weren't caught in that, we would have done better. And
right.
there was a sense of forgiveness, acknowledgement. Wow, I was a real idiot doing that. And he would be like, yeah, and I should have done this. And, that I think gets you to a place of, again, we did the best we could at that time. And, we wish we could have done better.
Yeah, I think that was, when I look back, my ex and I went out to lunch the day we got divorced, and
Hmm.
people like, how did you do that? And
Mm.
I'm not sure I actually know, but I think it was the right thing to do. We talked a little bit about writing and you being on both sides of the desk. As we are taping this today, the saga of the strike continues in
Ongoing.
ongoing. Talk about that from both perspectives, if you might.
I mean, I think, what I think is really interesting about the strike is, you have these moments in time, and especially right now, because, streaming is, there wasn't streaming before when we had the other contracts. So anytime you've got a disruptor or you've got a new technology or new distribution system, then how do you do compensation around it? And I think what's tricky a little bit is because what are we really talking about? Because a lot of what the writers are talking about, and understandably so, is off of an old model, which is when you had 22 episodes and you had a network model, and so your residuals were based on certain very specific metrics. Well, those metrics, understandably, from the production side, are saying, well, it doesn't apply because this is a different business model, which indeed it is. So I think it's sort of, how do you kind of come up with new rules? What are the new rules? How do we have protections that have some kind of teeth for AI? How do we do things, but we can't remain fully attached to the way things used to be, right? Because we do have these disruptors and they are new. So I think that's where the edges, where they're kind of bumping up against the edges of, how do we do something that's fair for writers? How do we not desecrate the whole idea that they're going to be writers, or that there's a certain amount of writers, or that what things look like in terms of, especially for television, um, and how do we get compensated in a residual based model in streaming? And at the same time, I think understanding, well, it can't be the exact old way. So what is that? And it's just the two sides have not been, there's been movement recently, which I think is good, and now there needs to be some kind of teeth in what those offers are. So I do believe we'll get there. I
It
think
it
we'll
will
have
get resolved. All strikes
it. Will.
ultimately do, but
They do. They
it
do.
has taken a while for both sides. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
audiences are waiting for it. One of the things I
Yeah.
enjoyed reading about in your bio was, like, you like to write stories with an international appeal. How do you know that? Because I know you have something in the works between a French company and an American company.
Yeah.
Certainly
Yeah.
talk,
Yeah. Yeah. No,
tell us about that.
I love it because I grew up in London. So I was schooled and educated in Europe, and I've always had a propensity towards, I guess, what you might call global stories, or what are things that, I mean, my character of Cece in my book is Italian, and a lot of my TV and film projects are what we would say co-productions, because they take place
Mm.
in other locations. Actually, I have two that are set in France. And this particular one is a very loose adaptation of Happy Family. It's using Cherie and other characters, um, but it is sort of a multiverse twist based on who would she be if she was raised by these different people in a multiverse situation. And it's between Paris and New York. So that is something that I've been working on. I went to Paris last summer, and we were ideally going to be going with this right before the strike happened. So we'll see what happens. But I love the idea of creating stories that kind of transcend being just an American story, or can sort of also show how unified we are, how specific we are culturally, but how we all are going through the same struggles. So I just love that. Plus, I just love travel. So
Well, now we really need the strike to be resolved quickly so we can see
exactly,
this great
get me to
adaptation.
Paris.
Get you
Exactly,
to Paris and get a
exactly,
fabulous adaptation, a loose adaptation
exactly.
of
Yes,
Happy Family. Tracy, I am honored to have you today. I hope you'll come back. There's so much more to talk about.
love to anytime, Grace.
Thanks for being on the Storytellers. This has been a
Thank you,
copyrighted
Grace.
episode of the Storytellers by Grace Sammon and Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. That concludes this episode of the Storytellers. I'm so glad you could be part of the story today. I hope you share the stories, tell your own, and come back for another episode, because when our stories are told, everything changes. I'm Grace Sammon.